Evening, all of you out there. Thanks for joining this webinar in our series, Fund Healthcare, Not Warfare. These sessions are sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action, Progressive Democrats of America, Our Revolution of Massachusetts, Citizens for Public Schools, and the Cambridge Residents Alliance. My name is Jonathan King, and I'm co-chair with Rosemary Keene of Mass Peace Action, and also chair of MAPA's longstanding Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. Now, in the midst of this terrible COVID-19 pandemic, many have asked, how come in the richest country on earth, we didn't have enough virus tests, masks, ventilators, gallons, and other personal protective equipment, or vaccines or therapies in the pipelines? And of course, one of the major reasons has been the diversion of the nation's wealth, our income tax dollars, into ever more expensive foreign wars, ever more expensive and deadly nuclear weapon systems, such as more Trident submarines, upgraded long-range bombers, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the cruise missiles. But this history started 75 years ago with the dropping of the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Though Japanese and Nazi militarists launched World War II, certainly the incineration of more than 100,000 Japanese civilians launched this terrible and continuing nuclear arms race that is still claiming victims, though now more indirectly. Now, before turning to our panelists, I want to note that in the beginning of this Fund Healthcare, Not Warfare, we were really focused on foreign wars, 800 bases abroad, new weapon systems. But with the social mobilization in response to the murder of George Floyd and too many others, we realized we also meant no warfare in the streets, no armored vehicles, no tear gas launchers, no assault weapons provided by Pentagon contractors to the police. As Martin Luther King pointed out so poignantly in opposing the war in Vietnam, the bombs dropped abroad end up being dropped at home. Now, our opening speaker is Joe Gerson, president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, member of the MAPA board, indefatigable campaigner for national and international nuclear disarmament. He actually organized this session together with Susan Mirsky and Jerry Ross from our Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. He'll be followed by Bill Hartung of the Institute for International Policy, also one of the leaders of development of the sustainable defense budget, which many of us look to as a kind of vision of a better world. And he'll share his expertise on the role of corporations in driving the nuclear arms race. We'll then take questions, maybe have a little break, and then we'll hear from Professor Elaine Scarry, author of Thermonuclear Monarchy, and the leader of the campaign to restrict the president's first use of nuclear weapons. And she'll be followed by our cleanup hitter, Shailly Gupta Barnes of the Riverside Church Kairos Institute and the National Poor People's Campaign, one of the lead authors of the Moral Budget and the Jubilee Budget, will be describing the growing mass movement against militarism and the war economy. So Joseph, take it away.
So thank you, Jonathan. I want to thank the fellow panelists who are giving their time and the effort to prepare for tonight, and those of you who are listening in. And I'm just going to jump right in here. The other day, I saw a comment that read, "More Americans believe in the tooth fairy than they do in the threat of nuclear war." Given the resistance to respecting scientific truths, to wearing face masks and funding virus tests, among the challenges we face if our species is to survive is overcoming magical thinking. We don't need people to suffer cancers and die from nuclear weapons tests that Trump wants to resume in order to know that our misbegotten national priorities are killing people. While Trump and his enablers resist spending for COVID-19 testing, there is $31.5 billion that we spend annually to prepare for and threaten nuclear omnicide. And there's plenty of money to send heavily armed brown shirt border patrol thugs into our cities. Before detailing Trump's assault on the arms control architecture built over the past 60 years and the particulars of his escalation of the arms race, I want to share news that should teach us that the possibility of nuclear war now may be as great as the threat of a global pandemic was a year ago. Lawrence Wilkerson, formerly Secretary of Defense Colin Powell's Chief of Staff, recently reported that during the first years of the Trump tyranny, Secretary of Defense Mattis ordered that no significant military action should be taken without his express approval. His reasoning? to prevent Trump from launching nuclear attacks amidst one of his rages. Mattis is no longer Secretary of Defense, and we cannot assume that his successor has erected, we cannot assume that his successor has erected a similar firebreak against nuclear catastrophe. Wilkerson also warned that Trump is poking his finger in China's eye with aggressive aircraft carrier deployments that could lead us to war with China or elsewhere with Iran in his desperate effort to rally support for the election that he appears destined to lose or to steal. Since then, the Pentagon has dispatched 2 aircraft carrier strike groups, including escort cruisers, destroyers, 120 warplanes, and 12,000 troops to South China Sea waters claimed by China. Secretary of State Pompeo issued a statement that can be read as the legal foundation for military actions designed to seize China's island bases in those contested waters. China responded by deploying fighter jets to its nearby base on Woody Island, reminded the world of its anti-aircraft carrier missile capabilities, and displayed its resolve with live fire exercises. And now a British aircraft carrier has joined the US fleet in the South China Sea. We should also remember that in the recent past, there have been unanticipated US-Chinese military incidents that brought us perilously close to military conflict. If Trump thinks that the US Marines can seize China's island bases, the consequences could prove far more deadly than his prediction that COVID-19 will simply disappear. And like the shots in Sarajevo that triggered World War I, what begins as a small incident or even a miscalculation could escalate beyond control. These provocations take place in the middle of the US campaign to restore its primacy, nuclear and otherwise, in part by destroying the nuclear arms control architecture built over the past 60 years. It began with Bush II's abrogation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that administration's campaign to deploy first strike-related missile defenses, and its evisceration of the meaning of deterrence. Then President Obama proved unwilling to expend the political capital needed to transform the nuclear weapons-free world vision of his inspiring Prague speech into policy. Obama renewed the US first strike doctrine, and to win Senate votes for the New START Treaty, he committed to upgrading the US nuclear arsenal and replacing the entire nuclear triad. Trump has since withdrawn from the INF Treaty, violated the UN treaty with Iran, is permitting the New START Treaty to expire, shattered the Open Skies Treaty, and is preparing to resume nuclear weapons testing. If Trump resumes nuclear weapons testing in violation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which the US has observed but not ratified, it will encourage other nuclear powers and nations that aspire to join the omnicidal nuclear club to follow suit. And whether tests are conducted underground or in the atmosphere, their inevitable fallout will generate untold cases of cancer and deaths. There is more. Trump's 2017 nuclear posture review included continuities from the Obama era, but it also contains significant differences. Rather than reducing US reliance on the nuclear arsenal as Obama had intended, it calls for increasing that reliance. Reiterating the first strike nuclear warfighting doctrine, it describes how first strike battlefield nukes could be used in a so-called conventional as well as a nuclear war. Toward this end, the US is deploying quote unquote more usable battlefield and strategic nuclear weapons in Europe. And the nuclear posture review also stated that extreme circumstances that could include significant non-nuclear strategic attacks, for example, cyber warfare attacks, might be met with nuclear counterattacks. Elaine will be talking more about first strike later, but this is that foundation. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea were identified as priorities for US nuclear war planning. This helps to explain the campaign to deploy intermediate range nuclear weapons in the Asia-Pacific region. And the Trump policy was clear that if North Korea uses nuclear weapons, which is to say North Korea would cease to exist, which is to say its people would cease to exist. A similar threat was made against Iran. Then to the hardware, whose estimated cost is now $2 trillion, an unimaginable sum, over the next 30 years. That's money we desperately need to build back better. The omnicidal fleet of Ohio-class submarines armed with Trident missiles is to be replaced with a new fleet of Columbia-class submarines. The 400 land-based ICBMs are to be replaced by a new generation of ground-based missiles. The B-52H and B-2A bombers, which carry nuclear-armed cruise missiles, will be replaced by new B-21 bombers and the nuclear-capable F-35 fighter jet. Trump wants to ramp up the production of the strategic arsenal's plutonium pits to 80 a year. That means 80 new nuclear weapons a year. And the country's nuclear weapons infrastructure, including command and control systems, are to get a redo. In terms of warheads, this will be a bit boring, but it's very real stuff. In terms of warheads, the new 87-1 thermonuclear weapon is to be loaded on the new generation of ground-based missiles, the most vulnerable leg of the triad. The B-61-12, which is to be deployed to military bases across Europe, and whose explosive power can be dialed up or down, allowing it to function as both a low-yield battlefield and a strategic region annihilating weapon, is generating what looks to be widespread opposition in Europe. A second mini-nuke, the W-93 low-yield warhead, with which sea-launched ballistic missiles are to be armed. Designed primarily for use against North Korea and China, they can also be armed with so-called conventional explosives, and we need to think about that word conventional. When conventionally armed, those on the receiving end won't know if they're to be victims of a conventional or nuclear attack, thus increasing the danger that they'll rely on nuclear retaliation. All of this is leading China to increase the size of its nuclear forces in order to maintain a deterrent second strike capacity. Let me then turn to sources of hope. With the devastations caused by the pandemic, the US will not be able to simultaneously reinvigorate our economy and spend trillions of dollars for the nuclear primacy campaign. A profound debate over US national budget priorities, including spending for nuclear weapons, is inevitable next year and has already begun. This underlines the importance of Democrats winning control of both houses of Congress, as well as sending Trump to jail or into Russian or Brazilian exile. Strength being found in unity, the struggle over national budget priorities also underlines the imperative of working in collaboration with social justice and human needs movements and organizations if we are all to prevail and prosper. In the late 1970s and early 80s, European fears sparked the protests that we here built into the Freeze movement that played a critical role in ending the Cold War. Their current plans to base more usable battlefield nuclear weapons across Europe are now terrifying Europeans who are aware of this existential threat. On August 9th, a new European Disarmament Coalition will be announced. The coalition includes the International Peace Bureau, the International Trade Union Confederation, with its 200 million members, the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, IPPNW, CND, Movement de la Paix, and many others. This will be the vanguard of a new and vital disarmament movement, which I hope will prove contagious. And on the other side of the planet, our Japanese partners have secured at least 11 million signatures on the Hibakusha Appeal for Peace, which I hope people listening to this webinar will sign and circulate. Those signatures will be presented to the UN next year to demonstrate international civil society's commitments and our will for nuclear weapons abolition. Finally, in thinking longer term, there is the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, promulgated by 122 nations at the UN 3 years ago. 81 countries have now signed it, and 40 of the 50 states needed to put it into force have ratified it. The treaty won't abolish nuclear weapons, but if movements in the umbrella states, primarily US allies, can win the signature and ratification of even one of these countries, it has the potential to unravel the diplomatic fabric of nuclear disorder. Friends, faced with the existential threats of nuclear war and climate emergency, there is no denying that we face daunting uphill struggles for human survival in the face of the nuclear and climate existential threats. Let me repeat that. We face daunting uphill struggles for human survival. But without that struggle, our fate and those of future generations will be sealed. We can and must overcome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joseph. Compelling. We'll move on directly to Bill, and then we'll take questions to the two of you. Bill, you're on.
Thank you. Thanks to Massachusetts Peace Action and all the organizers, and thank everybody for joining us. I'm going to talk about the nuclear weapons lobby and nuclear weapons being big business. As Joseph suggested, if we don't eliminate nuclear weapons, they could well eliminate us. And one of the reasons we haven't taken the common step of getting rid of them, the common sense step of getting rid of them, is because of the nuclear weapons lobby. There's big money to be made. In the most recent budget of the Trump administration, they proposed $45 billion for nuclear weapons. That's both at the Pentagon for nuclear delivery vehicles and at the Department of Energy for nuclear warheads. And in DOE in particular, the nuclear warhead budget was proposed for a 25% increase, which is almost unheard of. And this is at a time when almost everything related to human needs has been cut dramatically. So if you took that 45 billion, as the International Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons has pointed out, and you invested it in public health, you could fund 300,000 ICU beds, 35,000 ventilators, pay salaries for 150,000 nurses, and 75,000 emergency room doctors. So there's huge opportunities to shift this money to things that will address the actual threats that we're facing instead of making the world a more dangerous place. And as Joseph mentioned, we're on, if the Pentagon had its way, we would spend about $2 trillion on nuclear weapons, quote, modernization over the next 3 decades. And that sum could be used to pay for a Green New Deal, to pay for Medicare for all, to pay for all kinds of basic investments that we need to make our people safer. So what's standing in the way? Well, before that, I just want to make a couple points about why it's so urgent to do this. The International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War and Physicians for Social Responsibility did a study where they demonstrated that even 100 of the thousands of nuclear weapons that we now possess worldwide would kill 20 million people immediately and put 2 billion people at risk of famine. So literally using a small fraction of what exists would threaten life as we know it. And in terms of the specific weapons, former Secretary of Defense William Perry has pointed out that intercontinental ballistic missiles are among the most dangerous weapons in the world because in a crisis, the president would have to decide in a matter of minutes whether to launch them. So if there's a false alarm, a mistaken, warning, the president may well have to launch those weapons before it's clear if the U.S. is even under attack. So one thing that has to be happen soon along the way is to eliminate intercontinental ballistic missiles on the way to eliminating all nuclear weapons. So why can't we get this done? The elimination of nuclear weapons. One is nuclear ideologues. There's people whose careers are kind of tied to coming up with elaborate nuclear warfighting scenarios, none of which make sense, but which perpetuate jobs in the Pentagon, jobs in industry, jobs at the nuclear labs. So there's a kind of ideological component. And then there's the money. And the contractors that are going to build the new generation of nuclear weapons stand to make tens of billions of dollars doing so. And they include Northrop Grumman, which is going to make the new ICBM and the new nuclear bomber, General Dynamics, which will make a new nuclear armed submarine, Lockheed Martin, which will make the submarine launch ballistic missiles to go on those submarines, Honeywell, Bechtel, even universities like Texas A&M, University of California, which preside over the nuclear warhead complex. All these institutions want to keep that money flowing. And one thing the contractors are good at, of course, is spending that money on politicians. So for example, Northrop Grumman's team working on the ICBM has given $4 million just to members of the Armed Services Committees in the Senate and the House in the last 2 election cycles. Amongst those companies, which is about a dozen, they have over 500 lobbyists, almost one for every member of Congress. And when there was a recent effort by Ro Khanna of California to cut $1 billion from the ICBM budget, Northrop Grumman and Aerojet, which makes the motors for the new ICBM, lobbied intensively in the Armed Services Committee and managed to defeat that amendment, which was the common sense first step towards getting rid of nuclear weapons. Then we have the Congress. The Senate in particular has an ICBM coalition, which is composed of members who have ICBM bases or ICBM activity in their states. So they're relatively small states: Wyoming, North Dakota, Montana, Utah. But their senators have a lot of clout within their respective parties. And anytime there's been an effort to do things like study an alternative to ICBMs, reduce them under an arms control agreement, even destroy silos that have been left empty as a result of nuclear reductions, they have blocked those moves at every turn. And it's primarily about jobs in their states from these bases. But of course, they also are top recipients of money from the contractor. So this kind of symbiotic relationship between these states and their senators that depend on nuclear weapons money for part of their economy, and the contractors that profit from building those weapons. So there's obviously got to be a better way. And if we look at the economic part of the problem, virtually any other use of the same funds that are now being used to develop new nuclear weapons would create more jobs and be more constructive. So if you put the same money being put into nuclear weapons into, for example, green energy or infrastructure or transportation, you'd get about 1.5 times as many jobs. Likewise with public health. If you put it into education, you get about twice as many jobs as you get from spending on nuclear weapons. So there are alternatives, but we need a Congress and a president that are willing to do that. And that's not going to happen without massive grassroots pressure, which I think is beginning to grow. And I think it's reasonable to think that we can get there. There's a question of these military bases where the ICBMs are currently located. There's been a fair amount of experience of actually transforming former military bases into constructive civilian uses. In some cases, creating more jobs on the civilian side than existed when they were being used by the military. So, that's a possibility. But, I think I would say we shouldn't let a few thousand jobs in a few small states hold hostage the future of humanity. So although there are economic issues, they shouldn't be the primary issues that we confront when we're talking about nuclear weapons. There's been a couple promising developments recently. For the first time in decades, there was a vote in Congress to cut significantly the Pentagon budget by about 10%. Bernie Sanders in the Senate and Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan in the House led that effort. We didn't win. We didn't expect to win the first time around, but about a quarter of the Congress and a large chunk of the Democratic members voted in favor of a 10% cut. And this was against tremendous pressure from the other side. So I think with a new administration, given all the other needs we have for public health, for addressing climate change, for dealing with racial and economic inequality, there's going to be a lot of pressure on that budget. And I think we can recruit more members to vote for real reductions. Then finally, there's the question of Biden. And, compared to Trump, he's practically a peacenik. I mean, he wants to renew New START. He wants new negotiations with Russia to reduce nuclear weapons. He wants to reinstitute the Iran nuclear deal rather than threatening economic sanctions and war, as this administration has done. So there's a foundation there. But what he hasn't talked about is reducing the Pentagon budget or deep cuts in nuclear weapons initiated by the United States without waiting for other countries and seeing what they're going to do. So there's got to be pressure put there. But people like Senator Markey, who's had bills to block nuclear testing and to stop the nuclear modernization program, I think have set a good example. And I think we're kind of at the beginning of possibly a new resurgence of the peace movement in conjunction with the movements for all the other issues that we have to deal with, police violence, environmental degradation, and so forth. So I think we can muster enough power to be a countervailing force to the money and lobbyists and jobs arguments and all the things that the nuclear weapons lobby has brought to bear to stand in the way so far of a common sense nuclear policy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. Very, very compelling. All right, we're going to open up the floor, or at least the chat room, to questions. Cole will field them and read them out to our speakers, or comments.
Okay, Rita Deanda asks, how does our military spending compare to other countries?
Well, the United States spends more than the next 11 countries in the world combined, many of which are US allies. About 2.5 times what China spends and about 10 times what Russia spends, and infinitely more than a country like Iran or North Korea.
Okay, thank you. And Martha Spice of Peace Action Maine asks, where can we find out that if our senators are receiving funding from General Dynamics, for example, state and US?
The best resource is the Center for Responsive Politics. They have a website called Open Secrets. And if you go there, you can search General Dynamics and get a list of all the members of Congress that they give money to. So that's the easiest way to do it. And they track both political action committees run by the companies and also contributions by executives of those companies to members of Congress. At the state legislative level, it's harder to do. I don't know an obvious source for that.
Okay, great. And Roberta Keegan asks, over these many decades, we as residents of this country seem to have been successfully disunified, so that any effective mass organized effort to allay any of the outrageous assaults aimed now to our longevity as the even limited democracy to which we have so far risen can't possibly happen. I'm looking to see tonight that I'm wrong in thinking that should Joe Biden win at the polls and is successful at taking the oath of office for the presidency, that he, with his limited vision of what is truly needed to bring about needed basic changes, will only fill another 4 years preparing for Trump or another Trump-like successor to attain office in 2024.
So
Want to take that one, Joseph?
I'll take it, and to say, that's certainly a possibility, but really it's a question of what we'll do. I think as bad as Biden is, it would provide us with 4 years to organize and to push for the changes that we need and which are essential. If we're successful in that, then we can prevail. But if we're not, then the vision of right-wing consolidating power is still there. I'd point to the really broad agendas and visions of the Poor People's Campaign, about which we'll hear later, of Black Lives Matter, which is broad. And as I said in my talk, I think the challenge for us is to be working across issues, across race, because all these issues are ultimately related. And if we don't work together, we're going to fall.
Okay, so Brian Palmer asks, somehow Americans, among others, have lived with absurdly disproportionate military budgets for 70 or more years with relatively modest opposition. Why? Do we know to what extent the low level of opposition is due to lack of knowledge of the expenditures, or a belief that the spending is necessary, or a feeling that the flow of money cannot be stopped? Do you each have some favorite examples of public campaigns, images, or memes that have spotlighted the connections between military spending and an impoverished social system?
I'd like to take a crack at that, if you'll allow the chair to come back. Americans have been paying income taxes for a long time, 100 years. And in all those years, no agency of the federal government has ever reported back to the citizens how their income taxes are spent. And the average person has no idea that half the dollars they send to the US government are spent on war and war preparation. I know I give talks on this in communities, and people always tell me, oh, that can't be true. I would have known that it was true, right? And that is, something that there's deep agreement down below among the weapons lobbies. They don't want people to learn how the Congress is spending their money. And that's an area we in Peace Action have kind of tried to work, starting at the state level, to get bills saying that the government has to report to citizens how their tax dollars are spent. That's something I think in the current year, in the following years, we have to extend to other states. Thanks.
Okay, and Siddhartha Banerjee writes, glad to see Bill Hartung, whose talk I attended at Friends School in Wilmington, Delaware, more than 20 years ago. Bill, what about South Asia?
Well, I'm showing my age, I guess. And even 20 years ago, I had been doing this for a while, actually. Well, I think there's not enough discussion of the arms race in South Asia. And India and Pakistan, given their proximity, given the conflicts they've had over the years, that could well be an even more dangerous flashpoint for the possibility of a nuclear confrontation, even than the U.S.-Russian, competition, opposition at this point. And the study I mentioned about 20 million deaths and 2 billion people put on the brink of famine, the scenario they were looking at was a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan and what that would cause for the rest of the world. So I think, I'm glad the point was raised, because I think it's true sometimes too often when we discuss these things, we focus narrowly on US, Russia, China, and we don't look at the broader nuclear situation and the global threats that we face, which are not limited to the US-Russian competition.
Okay, great. Well, I think we could save remaining questions till after the next batch of speakers.
All right, let's move on to Elaine. Why don't you take the floor and tell us about the danger of first use?
Well, I first want to say it's a pleasure to be here. My head is spinning with these 2 information-rich lectures. And I'm also glad to be in the company of all the people, both from the United States and other countries like Sweden, where Brian Palmer is, and someone from India, and no doubt many other countries. And I also want to say that, like many people here, I'm also aware that there's someone here in spirit who's Bruce Blair, whose recent death is extremely painful to all of us, and is someone from whom we learn a great deal. So both Joseph and Bill have given a sense of the vast nuclear architecture, every single inch of which is being polished at great expense right now. And I want to just try and give a simple picture of that nuclear architecture and focus on the fact that it has 2 key features. One is the staggering level of injuries that nuclear weapons bring about. Bill mentioned the studies that show if even 0.03% of the current nuclear arsenal, worldwide nuclear arsenal of 13,000 weapons is used. 0.03%, over 20 million people will die on the first day, and 1 billion people, or I think Bill said maybe 2 billion in the first month. One observer in Australia notes that global warming may eliminate our species in 100 years, and the nuclear arsenal might do it in the next 100 minutes. This level of injury is such that the people of Earth have lost the right of self-defense, which is the right underlying every other right. And we've also lost our capacity for mutual aid, since the International Red Cross has said that if even a single city is hit, we won't have in all their worldwide resources the capacity to address it. The second feature is the fact that this staggering level of injury can all be initiated by a single person or by a tiny number of people. In the United States, it's a single person, the president, who launches the missile without any imposition of a break or testing by anyone in Congress, anyone in the population, anyone in his cabinet, anyone in the courts, no one. And this is something that during the Trump administration has caused a lot of alarm in the United States as well as in other countries. But it's crucial that we understand that this is not just a Trump problem, even though it's wildly dangerous during the Trump administration. We know that President Eisenhower contemplated a first strike in the Taiwan Straits in 1954. He again considered a first strike in Berlin in 1959. We know from Robert McNamara that John Kennedy 3 times came within a hairbreadth of all-out nuclear war. Nixon, after he ceased to be president, announced that he had 4 times considered a first strike. And Lyndon Johnson has reportedly considered using a first strike in China to prevent China from getting a nuclear weapon. So whatever happens in the election, we are not free of this problem and won't be until we eliminate nuclear weapons. Now, those 2 features that I just described could be described in terms of even a simple weapon, like, let's say, a gun or a knife. That is, there's what happens at the injuring end, and we know there's a obscene level of injury that these weapons bring about, and what happens at the infliction end or the agent end. And that is, again, an obscene arrangement where one person, or in, for example, Pakistan, 2 or 3 people together can bring about this outcome of genocide. And it's crucial to recognize those 2 ends, because the tools we have for dismantling the nuclear arsenal address those 2 different ends. International law relentlessly addresses the injuring side of the weapon. It looks at the kind of suffering that nuclear weapons bring about and recognizes the profound immorality of it and the profound illegality of it. That's true in the current treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, but also on earlier protocols. For example, the outlawing of disproportionate suffering is in the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, but also in the Geneva Protocols of 1935, 1949, and 1977, and other international provisions such as the outlawing of weapons that trespass across the boundary of neutral countries are also in both our current treaty and in past treaties like the 1907 Hague Convention. So to the 1948 Convention on the Prohibition and Prevention of Genocide, which our own government in the 1995 International Court of Justice case said the United States would not be guilty of, even if it used weapons first. You can hear in the international law explicit ethical content. There's no mistaking it. When you turn to national law, constitutional law in the United States, constitutional law in the other countries, what it's addressing is not the injuring end of the weapon, but the agency end. It sets up, its laws set up procedures that are currently just being flaunted. And that means that we can use those procedures just as we can use international law to work to dismantle this arsenal. So national laws, the United States law, as probably everyone knows, the Constitution requires that before you ever injure a foreign population, you have to have convinced 535 people in the Congress, or a sizable portion of them, that there's really a reason to do that. It isn't something someone decides an impulse of 6 minutes. the time that Bruce Blair tells us is the time the president has, if he hears about incoming missiles, to make a decision. And this is something that has just been pushed in the trash since the invention of nuclear weapons. We haven't had a declaration of war, even for conventional wars, that is in Korea, in Vietnam, even Iraq was just a kind of conditional declaration of war, which is not a legitimate declaration. Current legislation that we all need to be supporting in the United States is based on this constitutional provision, this key fact of governance. The Markey-Liu bill, which restricts the president's ability to initiate first use unless he has explicit authorization from Congress, and the Warren-Smith bill, which outlaws first use altogether. It's crucial to realize that other nuclear states also have parallel constitutional provisions. For example, France has Article 35 that says its parliament will oversee that country's entry into war. So too in India, Article 246 stipulates that it's parliament that oversees war and peace in that country. Russia has Article 102 that says that the what's called the Federal Council, which is the equivalent of our Senate, controls whether the country ever goes beyond its own border to perform an offensive act of war. Up to its own borders, the president can act alone to defend it. But once it goes over the border, it needs to have the authorization of that Federal Council. So these seem like just procedures, but they actually have as deep and profound an ethical basis as the international law has in addressing the ghastly and obscene forms of suffering. It's not a coincidence that that same provision turns up in Russia and India and France and the United States. It turns up there because centuries of social contract thinking have said that the key provision of social contract is to prevent war and to prevent injury. Hobbes said, the social contract exists for getting us out of the miserable condition of war. So it did that by putting a major impediment between us and our desires to harm other people and what we have to go through to lift that brake and go ahead and injure other people. The ethical basis of this can be seen by the fact that it's completely, it underscores the fact that the current arrangements, the current architecture is wholly incompatible with governance. And if you ask people if they think nuclear weapons are incompatible with governance, they'll often list 4 ways in which they can right away see that it is, or 3 ways. And the one I'm talking about is the 4th way. So one way is nuclear weapons are very susceptible to accidents. That means they're hard to govern, hard to control. We know that the United States accidentally sent nuclear triggers to Taiwan when it was supposed to be sending helicopter batteries. We know that President Carter accidentally sent the nuclear codes in his suit jacket to the cleaners. And we know that Clinton lost his nuclear codes for several months and was too embarrassed to tell the Pentagon. A second way in which the nuclear arsenal is utterly at odds with any form of governance was mentioned by Bill. And that is that these weapons can destroy us, but we seem unable to destroy them. That means that they are, as Bill Joy once pointed out, an instance of kind of robot rebellion. They can eliminate us, but we've convinced ourselves that we can't eliminate them. A third way in which people right away see that nuclear weapons are ungovernable is the fact that they can be appropriated by hackers. Either Joseph or Bill mentioned the F-35, which was subject to a hacking incident. And the year in which that happened was one of 18,000 hacking incidents in the federal government. It can also be appropriated by terrorists. It can be appropriated by non-state actors. That is a way in which they are, again, ungovernable. But these 3 ways of being ungovernable, their susceptibility to accidents, the fact that they can destroy us and we can't destroy them, and the fact that they can be appropriated by non-state actors could give us the false impression that there could ever be a legitimate way of using these weapons. And there simply isn't a legitimate way, because the state actors, the heads of nations that have these nuclear weapons, are the ones who have put 10,000 steps into place, not the one step that the terrorist takes or the one step that the accident brings about. And that all of this is done in the service of or with an arrangement of first use that is, again, spectacularly incompatible with constitutional law and with centuries of social contract theory. Thomas Hobbes said that the worst thing that could ever happen in a country is the massacre of its citizenry. And he said, if that were to happen, it couldn't be that it happened in a democracy, it couldn't happen in an oligarchy, it couldn't happen in an aristocracy, it couldn't even happen in a monarchy. It could only happen, he said, if there was zero governance at all, which is something that we approach right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Somewhat takes your breath away when you hear the full analysis. But we do have hope out there. We have some broad new movements developing that we haven't seen, and not since 50 years ago. So Shailly Gupta Barnes, who's at Riverside Church Kairos Institute, but also with the National Poor People's Campaign, is going to be our cleanup hitter.
Thank you, everybody. This is a very timely conversation for many reasons, especially as we are witnessing the effects of U.S. militarism that's been applied for decades around the world, now applied deliberately here at home, in the most expansive way, in probably recent memory. One of the groups that I've learned from over the years, a key partner of the Poor People's Campaign, some of you may be familiar with, it's called the Border Network for Human Rights. They're based in Texas. They work in border communities in Texas and New Mexico. They've long said that the border is often treated as this place where the boundaries of what is legal and illegal is pushed to the extreme. People obviously are deemed illegal, but what that opens up is the application of policing, of law, of military force that violates any rights that those people would have otherwise. And many of them are, legal citizens of this country living in these border communities, but their rights are suspended in that territory, and they're subject to unconstitutional searches, the deployment of active duty military troops on this side of the border. And Fernando Garcia, the director of the Border Network, has long said that this application of force, military force at the border, it doesn't stay at the border. Eventually it comes into the interior, and we're seeing that. We have been seeing that for the past few years. But now with the deployment of federal troops to Portland, to Chicago, and elsewhere, under the guise of protecting federal property, but really aimed at violating our constitutional rights, violating the democracy that generations have fought and died for. Presently, and leading up to November, and beyond, these are very serious implications. And as Joseph started us off with, we are in very daunting times. We at the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, we take this very seriously because of our relationship with these communities on the border and the interior who have been facing this militarized violence for years, for generations, especially when we talk about our Native and Indigenous communities in this country. And that's why we've dedicated a good portion of the moral policy platform we just released, the Poor People's Jubilee platform, to ending militarism, to ending war, and redirecting the resources we currently spend on the military, both from the military budget, but the militarized elements of the broader federal budget, to meet our needs. Some of the ways that we could cut the military, which as Bill mentioned earlier, is larger than the next several countries combined. This is what we list in the Jubilee platform, and it's based on the work that we did with our Poor People's Moral Budget. We could cut it by 10%. It was raised last week in Congress. We could cut it by as much as 50% and still have the largest military in the world. But some of the specifics that we include are around closing bases, closing 60% of the 800 bases we have around the world, as well as domestic bases in this country that we don't need. Ending the wars, ending the forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Yemen, and bringing those troops home. You know, and when we shrink our military, we need fewer weapons. We call for canceling the new procurement of weapons, but also reducing existing weapon systems that are obsolete, ineffective, or excessive, including you know, canceling nuclear upgrades, including the modernization efforts that were mentioned earlier, destroying our nuclear stockpiles, and developing new treaties for complete nuclear disarmament. And there are other prescriptions in that Jubilee platform. But we also, in our discussion of cuts to the military, we include a discussion of healthcare, because working with the National Priorities Project, we found that we could convert, you know, if we converted the resources that are put into the military health system, if we put those towards a universal healthcare system that works for everybody, including veterans, including troops and their families, we would save $33 billion per year. That's, you know, almost 10% of the $350 billion we would like to cut from the military budget and invest in the things that we do need, which, in addition to universal health care and securing Medicare for all, would expand our healthcare infrastructure, open the hospitals that have been closed, train more personnel to make sure that we have healthcare in rural communities and poor communities and low-income communities and indigenous communities, so everybody has the healthcare we need. We could expand affordable housing, including public housing, have more rental assistance, new welfare programs, including a guaranteed income, a federal jobs program that could rebuild our water and sanitation infrastructure and protect our public education systems and move us away from fossil fuels and a war economy and towards a green and just economy that works for us all. And as others have said, you know, we no longer have to accept the argument that there isn't the money for these kinds of things. We've seen through this pandemic that just isn't true. On the one hand, we've seen trillions of dollars that were raised and moved in response. So one, resources can be raised in times that require them, and these are those times. But two, we've seen how those resources can be misused. You know, billionaires have seen their wealth increase by over $700 billion in the past 4 months. Police departments have hundreds of millions of dollars in excess equipment and military surplus equipment, so they're equipped. But we still do not have universal health care. We do not have universal housing. We do not have universal income guarantees. In an economic recession that is shattering all previous records of the Great Recession, approaching a depression that will take years to recover from, more years than the 2008 crisis did. And so the Poor People's Campaign is calling for this Jubilee platform for an infusion of resources from the military, from new taxes, from new investments and appropriations towards this agenda. And we use the term Jubilee deliberately. It's not a term we use lightly, and it shouldn't be used lightly. Many of you will probably be familiar, but Jubilee is a biblical term. The Jubilee Codes established a covenant, a commitment to cancel debts, release slaves, pay wages, and provide for the poor and hungry, and allow farmland to recover, allow to recover from the ecological devastation that was going on at the time. The Jubilee was a comprehensive economic program to right the wrongs of the land and liberate people from an economic system that was waging death and misery, and to establish an economy that shared the abundance of that time with everybody. This is the promise carried forward today in this Jubilee platform. We've been investing in death. We have to invest in life. We've been investing in the military and the wealthy and corporations. Now we have to invest in the people who have built up this country and make it run every day. We can no longer be abandoned in an era of abundance. And just like the Jubilee Codes of eras past, the Jubilee platform today calls for canceling debts. It calls for defunding the police, for defunding the military, and for providing for the poor by moving the abundance and productive capacity we have today, the brilliant minds and resources and systems, towards establishing systems and structures that protect life, that defend life, and that honor life rather than take it. We know we deserve no less.
Thank you, Shailly, and thanks to all the folks at the Poor People's Campaign who have developed this alternative, rich budget. So we have a few more minutes. Let's open it up. Cole will be reading the chat.
Okay, so Jim Anderson asks, have you a suggestion for how to proceed in this intersectional moment? And that could go to any of the speakers.
Well, I certainly think that it's important that we just turn out for things, and that we turn out in a number of ways, that we contact, in the case of first use and trying to eliminate first use, it would mean actually contacting people in Congress, this may require really tens of thousands of people doing it before Congress will get those pieces of legislation passed. They're utopian pieces of legislation, and yet even something like the New York Times that normally doesn't support fanciful legislation and actually doesn't that often address the US nuclear arsenal. It tends to look at other arsenals of, say, North Korea that has fewer than 30 missiles, and we have 6,000 missiles. But even the New York Times has said it's crucial that this legislation get passed. And it's not going to happen. I fear that it's not going to happen unless people in large numbers come forward and let their legislators know that they have to have this happen. I also think that if people simply cite the fact, the laws, it will help it to happen. Help it to happen. This is, I think, widely done by the citizenry in terms of international law, again, because it has that overt ethical content. But people don't often enough say, hold up the Constitution and say, this has to be followed. And the reason for that is because the Constitution is utterly incompatible with nuclear weapons. And we just threw the Constitution out, or its most important provisions out, in 1945. And so now we look at it and we say, this isn't important. It is important because it can actually dismantle this nuclear arsenal. And so we need to bring it to bear.
I would jump in for a second and say, I think Shailly, kind of laid out an agenda for us, and working with organizations that have this broad vision is important. And part of it is just showing up in our various communities. There are Black Lives Matter demonstrations. There's efforts to prevent evictions, funding for subsidies. And part of it is we have to show up if we're going to build trust with people who we want to be allies with us. So I think showing up is an important part. The last thing I'll say is the election in November. Ultimately, the outcome of that will impact issues across the spectrum, and we both have to turn out to elect the most progressive people we can, and at the same time be preparing for pressing the people who are elected or demonstrating against them the very next day.
Yeah, I would agree. The Poor People's Campaign, we are organized in 45 states across the country, and each state, is organized both around this platform, but around taking action together. What we learned from few moral movements in our nation's history and the history from around the world is that the power to change society doesn't come from anywhere. It comes from people taking action together, and that's what we are motivated by. And when we look at the history of the Poor People's Campaign, the 1968 campaign, when Reverend Dr. King was talking about fighting against poverty, against racism, and against militarism, he said that he called poor and dispossessed people taking action against these triplet evils that were inescapably related. They called them a new and unsettling force, because only that force could reveal their relationship, but also awaken the country to the violence that's being waged inside and without, and make all those connections. And so we are attempting to build that power on the ground, in the streets, in the legislators. And yes, leading up to November, we have 100 days ahead of us, and we will be, each of our committees will be registering and mobilizing and organizing and educating voters around this platform to hold hold whoever is elected in Congress, and our highest offices in this country to this agenda, to meeting our needs, to moving resources out of the military, and reviving the heart and soul of this democracy.
Can I say, in Massachusetts, we have a golden opportunity because we have a very intimate relationship between the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign, one of whose tri-chair, Sabina Martin, is on the Mass Peace Action Board, and a number of us are very active in the Poor People's Campaign. And so we're in a position to try to figure out, how do we work together most closely. We have, of course, the primary coming up September 1st, so we have to move more quickly because there's likely to be some voter suppression there. But also, around the demilitarization of the police, that's going to be done by city councils, hasn't been done by the state legislature. That's going to be an area where, we're going to try to work together to support the movement for Black Lives Matters and the Poor People's Campaign, where we have some particular expertise around militarism.
Okay, let me try a new question from Lynn Mystic Healer in North Bend, Oregon. How do we get legislation for new WPA, heart and soul community services for all, with a good basic guaranteed income, with single payer health care, and tiny homes or apartments for all, so that we can unite humanity beyond race, religions, gender, and political divides?
Well, I'd say one place to begin is the new Green Deal, right? I mean, it doesn't carry all of that, but it will not only help to save the planet, and Lord knows Trump is doing his best to accelerate climate change, but there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure development in that, which means jobs, incomes, and more economic security. I think clearly that, given the crisis that we're in, the legacy of the New Deal, even beyond the climate dimension of it, the New Deal from the 1930s and early 40s, should be something that we should be tapping in. It's part of the U.S. history, legacy, and culture, and we need to build on that for security for the longer term.
We know that the military is one of the biggest institutional polluters in the world, and so as this is really core. The vision of the Green New Deal was an inspiration, I think, to many of us in very different campaigns, and we've certainly drawn on some of that in the Jubilee platform. And I think this is where we do need the kind of best minds coming together to raise all of these issues together, because as we understand it, as I understand it, we can't have to have a movement that's against the war and against militarism and against and against nuclear weapons that is about life. It has to be also against ecological devastation. It has to be anti-racist, and it has to be against poverty, because the relationship between all of those things, wars are waged against poor people for the resources that they have, mainly poor people of color around the world, and it's a way to divide poor people of all colors, so we can't come together and form the kind of power that can fundamentally change that. And so we are inspired by the vision and leadership behind the Green New Deal, and really hope to join forces, towards November and beyond, with everybody who's on the side of turning this country around, so we can really, play the kind of global leadership we played in the past.
So let me close on this high note. Here in Massachusetts, we know that we have elections of national significance on September 1st. All of the groups who sponsored this series were not think tanks. We all have folks on the ground. We will be trying to turn out the vote. So tune in. We'll be trying to continually talk about mobilizing for the September 1st primary. Of course, then after that for the November election. But right now we have the September 1st primary in front of us. So stay tuned. We'll be having other webinars before that time. On that, I want to thank all of the participants. It was an enormously valuable session. Luckily, it was recorded. We will send this link around to make sure people who couldn't weigh in have a chance to listen to it. We have another, and Joseph, when is Reverend Liz webinar?
It's Liz Theo Harris. I think she's on August this was it August
7th.
August the 7th, the New Hampshire
Friday night.
event related to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there'll be a leading A-bomb survivor speaking there as well. Also, just to say that on August 4th, we're going to have a webinar which will focus on the authoritarianism that's coming down at us with Larry Wilkerson, Colin Powell's former chief of staff, and I'm blanking on the man's name, Mike
Crenshaw. He's an
Crenshaw,
activist in Portland.
right. So people will be encouraged to join us then as well.
So one last point that may be a little corny to the 75 people who are out there. Most times of the year, it's tough to get a letter to the editor, even in a local weekly about War and Peace. But this is the 1 week of the year, August 6th and August 9th, when editors recognize, oh, that is a distinctive time during the year. So this is a time that you can send a letter to the editor to your local weekly about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the continuing waste of human resources and danger of nuclear war and the need to fund healthcare, not warfare. So on that, thank you all. Good night, and we'll talk again soon.